All right, we are studying Esther and Mordecai. I do want to note a correction that I caught since last week on the notes. The very first thing that it mentions on the notes of Esther and Mordecai, how that Esther lived around 478 BC, and then it says Assyrian captivity. That really should be Babylonian captivity. The Assyrian captivity was about 100 years earlier when Israel was taken away captive, and then about 100 years after that is when Nebuchadnezzar came and took away the Jews from Judah, and so there really should be Babylonian captivity. But we've got Esther, whose second name is Hadassah. Yes, I know the screen is messed up. I saw it too. Hadassah's name in Hebrew means myrtle, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Probably very applicable, given the fact that when myrtles, when they bloom, they're real pretty. And of course, we're told that Esther was very beautiful. And the interesting thing in Esther chapter 2 in particular that we notice is how that Esther gained favor with all those who saw her. Whether that had, obviously, her beauty had something to do with that, perhaps her bearing, her humility may have had something to do with that as well. Another thing we talked about, one of the things that we discussed was Queen Vashti or Vashti. And I was talking to Elizabeth after class Wednesday night, and we were talking about how that for whatever reason, both of us at some point from some place, there was mention of the king wanting Queen Vashti to come dance or to come parade naked or something like that. And of course, we talked. Of course, as in class, we read chapter 1 how that wasn't part of the request from the king, at least not explicitly mentioned in chapter 1, but that he wanted her to wear her crown and basically, parade her to show off her beauty. But there's nothing in there about him requesting her to dance or to not be wearing clothes or anything like that. But Elizabeth and I were talking about that after class, that for whatever reason, I don't know if it was a movie that mentioned it or what, but I know that there have been mentions of Queen Vashti refusing to dance. And in Jewish custom, that is implied in chapter 1. In the Jewish custom, they teach that Queen Vashti was to only come out wearing her crown, nothing else, and to dance. So whether or not that Jewish component was repeated in some movie or whatnot, I don't know. But Elizabeth mentioned something to me after class last week, and I thought, I said, that sounds familiar to me too. I don't know where I heard that, but that's not in the account. And so, in case anybody was wondering about that, that's the ultimate source would be Jewish tradition with regard to Queen Vashti, and that's not recorded in chapter 1.
She wasn't a Jew?
No, she wasn't. She wasn't a Jew. But according to Jewish tradition of their reading of Esther, when they read that the king requested her to come out wearing her crown, they took that to mean only wearing her crown. And so it is taught in Jewish tradition that that's what his request was. So however that permeated, and again, I'm almost convinced it was a movie or a reference in a movie or something that I remember hearing it from. Elizabeth thought maybe it was A Night with the King, but she looked into it and it doesn't sound like that one mentions anything about it. So it's kind of weird, but both of us have heard that told. I don't remember where. Sometimes this account and the account with Herodotus' daughter kind of get intermingled sometimes, because remember Herodotus, her daughter danced for Herod, and it pleased him, and he said, just name whatever you want. And her mother had the daughter request John the Baptist's head on a platter. She came out and danced. That's of course that's in the New Testament. She doesn't say that she was naked or anything like that, but she came out and danced, and it pleased the king. So sometimes those two may get interchanged or merged together a little bit in the retelling of it from different people. But these are obviously two separate accounts, and Queen Vashti, it doesn't say anything about her dancing or not wearing clothes or anything like that. Of course, she didn't come. That's the point. Is she didn't come out. She was like, no, I'm not doing that. So anyway, I thought that was worth bearing mention, since I know that that's been told that way somehow, somewhere. I just can't remember from where that was told. All right, so we've been kind of noticing Esther primarily through chapter 2 thus far. We ended Wednesday night looking at how that Esther continued to obey Mordecai. It mentions that Esther, she always obeyed Mordecai when she was growing up. Of course, Mordecai served as almost a father or uncle to her, even though in blood relation, what were they? Cousins. Yeah, they were cousins by blood relation, but by relationship, Mordecai served almost as a father / uncle to that extent, because basically he raised her. So in verse 21, we see, in those days while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Now, this particular event is going to feature prominently towards the end of the book of Esther. And yet, I love how Esther is recorded almost basically in chronological order of the events and how they took place, with no foreshadowing really that happens. It's here's what happened, here's what happened, here's what happened, and oh yeah, you remember that thing that happened back in chapter 2? Well, that has now become a huge component of the narrative going forward into chapter 4 and chapter 5. So it's really interesting how all of that takes place. Anything through chapter 2. And we're picking up on the characteristics of Esther. I decided as we were going through, we'll go through Esther, then we'll go back through Mordecai. But we see how that she obeyed the voice of Mordecai. She heeded the advice. Remember, we talked about it was Haggai is his name, not Haggai. Haggai or Heggie. Heggie sounds weird. Haggai. How that she relied on his advice back in verse 15 with regard to what to take with her to the king. Okay, she, instead of taking any personal items or whatever, she relied on the advice of Haggai, the head of taking care of all these women. And of course, he would probably know what was best. And so there's both humility there for her not thinking to herself, well, I know what's best and I'll take what I want. And also wisdom and acknowledging that somebody else is going to have a better idea on how to handle this than I will. So there's that. Then, of course, we talked about the fact that she received favor in the sight of all who saw her. Both Haggai is one. The king is another we see in chapter 2. And, of course, it mentions everyone as well. In fact, throughout the entire book of Esther, that is a common theme, that she gains favor in the sight of everybody. And I think that, again, yeah, is her beauty part of it? Sure. But you know what? It doesn't matter how attractive a person is, beauty-wise. If they're a nasty person, are they really that attractive? Okay, seeing somebody from afar, oh, that person's beautiful, man or woman, they're very attractive. But then once you actually maybe hear them speak or kind of get a feeling for their character or their attitude, if they are a nasty individual, then a lot of times that just not even attractive anymore. And that's why when it says that she gained favor, I tend to think that this is more than just her beauty. That it's her bearing, her attitude, her care for others, her humility, her submissiveness. All of those elements, all of those components and characteristics, I think, are kind of combining. And certainly, who through his providence is bringing this about? Ultimately, it's God. Okay, and that's one thing, even though the term is never mentioned in the book of Esther, providence is interwoven through the entire account, both with Esther and Mordecai as well. Anything through chapter 2? Yes, sir?
Not that it's super important. It is interesting to me to note there are a number of time markers within the book.
Yeah.
So, it's a short book. You can read these 10 chapters in 50 minutes, but, by verse 7 of chapter 3, we're already in the 12th year of this guy's reign.
Right.
So there's space in between these things.
It's not all happening all at the same time.
Right. Yeah, growing up, it's like, oh, the next day or the next week.
Right. Right. And that's really important to note, not just in the book of Esther, but throughout the entire Bible. I mean, going into the New Testament, the book of Acts, okay, these journeys that took years, okay, I mean, Paul describes 14 years passing between the time that Paul went to Jerusalem, from Damascus to the time that he went to Jerusalem, or however he worded that there in Galatians chapter 2. Paul kind of gives us a timeline of the years that passed. But in the book of Acts, you read it, and it doesn't feel like that much time is passing. And so that's a really important component to remember, that time is passing normally, just like it does for everybody. But these events are being recorded for us, and even if they're chronological, a lot of times we don't get that feeling of the passage of time. So yeah, it's a good point, Nolan. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say that the Bible I'm using tonight, it's still English Standard, but after gallows, it has a footnote that says, or wooden beam or stake, Hebrew tree or wood. This Persian execution practice involved affixing or impaling a person on a stake or pole. And they give Ezra 6:11. So when you say gallows to me,
I think of hanging somebody.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's interesting. They may have been more like impaled.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Put them on a tree.
I had not heard that. I have not read that anywhere before. That's interesting. Well, that puts a new spin on what's going to happen later as well, with the gallows that will be built. If it's not a gallows and it's more of a impaling spike, that adds a little bit more graphicness to it. Oh, it does. Okay, interesting. All right.
The lumber had not gone up.
Oh yeah, price of lumber was pretty low then. That's right.
In Ezra 6:11 it says, also I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made dung.
Nice. All right. Anything else from chapter 2? All right, chapter 3. Oh. All right, so we have an individual named Haman that gets introduced into the narrative now. Starting in verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Okay, there is a question, and I know this has more to do with Mordecai and not so much Esther, but when we're told to obey the governing authorities and whatnot, okay, that's within the realm of those things that as long as it doesn't cause us to contradict a commandment of God. We see that principle shown in the New Testament. That being the case, why won't Mordecai bow to Haman?
Because he wasn't supposed to.
Okay, why not?
Well, he wasn't a king.
Okay, first of all, he wasn't a king, but the king commanded it.
Well, he was trying to be worshipped, I guess, because he's not going to, I mean, it reminds me of Daniel. Daniel's not going to do what they said, he's going to do what he knows to be right.
Right.
And that's the same thing Mordecai did. He knew that was wrong,
Right.
And he wasn't going to bow down and pay homage
Right.
to someone that wasn't from God.
Well, and homage tends to carry with it more of a reverence feeling. It's not just a sign of respect. It's tinged with reverence. And Mordecai, it's not that Mordecai was deliberately being insightful or that he was being stubborn, but Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman.
Because he was an Amalekite or the Agagite.
Agagite.
The history of the Jews.
I haven't read anything about now the Amalekites, of course we know about, but the Agagites, I don't know anything about the Agagites.
Agag, the one that got all hacked up with it. Am I remembering that?
Was it Agag or Agog? It may have been.
That Samuel, or not the one, but
The Agites and the Amalekites might have been the same thing. They might have been. Yeah, that's interesting. It could be. It could be the fact of his background or ethnicity. That could be. I tend to think that this was a principal thing for Mordecai, that this paying homage to this man, first of all, he's not the king, okay? And second of all, it suggests that there is some sort of a reverence, kind of worship element to it, and Mordecai is not going to do that because he serves Jehovah. And there may have been more to it than that. But regardless, does the account suggest that this was wrong of Mordecai to not bow down to Haman? In fact, if anything, the fact that this drives Haman crazy. If this were a law issue, what could Haman simply have done? Could have told the king, right? Hey, king, you told everybody to bow down to me, but this man won't do it. Put him to death or something like that. So there must have been more elements, more kind of a broader situation here that it drove Haman crazy. But despite that, Haman either A, wasn't going to go tattletelling, maybe that was part of it, or B, that maybe this was, even though the king commanded it, maybe it wasn't like maybe it was more like a guideline than a rule, that type of thing. I don't know why Haman wouldn't have simply, because Haman then concocts this entire thing just to get back at Haman and the Jews, really because Haman drives him nuts, or because Mordecai drives Haman nuts here, and all of that is kind of a key component going forward. But regardless, it says that all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. There's two commentaries, I think it was, that suggested that the commandment was only to the king's servants at the gate, that it didn't include Mordecai, but that Haman felt that Mordecai should do it with the rest of the king's servants because Mordecai was sitting there. And why was Mordecai there anyway? Because he's waiting to check up on Esther all the time. Okay? He's wanting to hear from Esther, make sure she's doing okay. And so Mordecai is not one of the king's servants at the gate. Now, whether Haman knows that, okay, I don't know that Haman knows that. Maybe he does, but these commentaries suggested that the commandment was only to those king's servants at the king's gate, but it didn't apply to anyone else outside of those in that service. And so even though Mordecai, that commandment didn't apply to him, Haman felt like, well, he should still show me respect. And so that's a possibility as well. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and I mean, just the little bit that we know, he wasn't being attracting attention to himself,
Right.
or any of that. I mean, if someone
He wasn't being disrespectful.
No, if someone told me I had to bow to the president, I'd be okay. I'm leaving.
Yeah.
I don't care who the president is. I'm not going to bow to them. I
Yeah.
will be respectful.
Right. Honor the king, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know that I would want to go see the Queen of England if I have to bow to her. I would curtsy, but I'm not bowing.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, that is reserved for my God.
Right.
And, I mean, I might play bow to some people, but,
Right. Well, and of course, there's a custom element, like in Japan, they half bow.
Yeah.
There's a difference between that respect bow versus laying prostrate, bowing almost in worship.
But this was if he passed by. They
Yeah.
bow and greeting. They don't bow necessarily
Right.
when they're just walking by someone.
Right.
And Haman's just going through the gate and they expect everybody to bow down, which the little bit I know about history and what I've seen in culture is you only do that with royalty or someone that,
Is to be
bow
worshipped,
before
yep.
God. Yeah,
Yep.
they're worshipped.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, we take it for granted because we don't really do it.
Yeah.
It's not a part of our culture.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, I mean, it's a
It sure is. Yeah.
Well, we're getting off track probably with this, some I don't wanna pull on it too much, but the Jews did bow to kings.
Yeah.
And so that wouldn't have been so weird if the king walked on, so there's something specific about Haman, like you're saying.
Right. And bowing in honor versus bowing in worship were two different things as well. And certainly that was culturally acknowledged also. So, yeah, that's a component too. Yeah, so there must have been something a little bit different with this. Yeah. Verse 3, the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Again, these two commentaries that mention the possibility that this didn't apply to Mordecai suggest that maybe the king's servants didn't know that. Didn't know that this didn't apply to Mordecai, or that Mordecai wasn't one of the king's servants. I don't, obviously this is recorded for a reason. I don't think Mordecai was being disrespectful, and obviously this wasn't something that was, even if it was a command that that it applied to him, it wasn't such a command that not doing it automatically led to death. I mean, you would think this would have been reported back. If it was one of those commandments where everybody must do it, and if anybody doesn't, you're going to be lined up for death.
Well, apparently it went on for a while. 'Cause
Yeah, oh, yeah.
They spoke to him day after day.
Yeah. So it's kind of odd, kind of the whatever the culture element here is, whatever the king's servants didn't know, Haman didn't know about Mordecai, whatever it may have been, all of that. Certainly, I don't believe that Mordecai. The end result is I don't believe Mordecai was sinning by not obeying the king's command here, because I believe that there was some element of worship perhaps involved in this, and Mordecai wasn't going to do that. It's not that he just didn't like Haman, it's that he wasn't going to bow down in worship to anybody. Verse 4, now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. So notice, and this again kind of lends credence to what these commentaries are saying about the fact that the king's command was only to the king's servants at the gate. So in Mordecai's, his own defense, he said, I'm a Jew, whether that meant that I'm not a part of the king's service here at the gate, or if it meant that that rule doesn't apply to me because I'm a Jew, and as a Jew, we don't bow down and worship to anybody other than Jehovah. And maybe the king in the captivity, of course, there was some elements that were retained in terms of culture that the king allowed the Jews to retain. And so it may have been that there were certain things that he allowed the Jews for their own worship of Jehovah, that they didn't have to bow down and worship to the false gods of Babylon or whatever. That may have been a part of it. I don't know. But it is interesting that what Mordecai's response to this is, I'm a Jew. So that whatever component was involved in that, this explains why I don't bow down. Again, whether that commandment didn't apply to him because he's not a member of the king's servants at the gate, or because as a Jew he didn't bow down to worship, regardless, this was his response to that. Nolan, is that your finger up?
I find it intriguing, and there's just the briefest reference to when Mordecai was one of those carried away.
His grandfather, yeah.
And all that. But that neither Mordecai nor Esther, nobody here knows they're Jews.
Right.
But they're so involved. Was it because of that carried away when they took the cream of the crop and they just were going to culturally and education, everything, just make them one of us?
Yeah.
Convert them, so to speak.
To assimilate, yeah.
That nobody's aware these are Jews living right among us in the king's court.
Right.
Now to become queen.
Well, I think it's interesting that a lot of times in our mind we picture our ability to properly judge scale is kind of skewed by our culture and our society. The scale of how many of the king's servants there might have been at the king's gate, okay, we may be talking about thousands of people. Okay, so it's very possible that even if Mordecai was there every single day, there may have been different servants there seeing him. So it may not necessarily have been just a group of 30 people, and oh yeah, we know Mordecai, he's a Jew, and everybody knows he's a Jew. Of course, the fact that Mordecai is a Jew is going to be known. Haman's going to know it. The fact that Esther is not, certainly that speaks, first of all, to enough assimilation by this, third or fourth generation at this point, that first of all, physically, there's no major giveaway in terms of her skin or her bone structure or whatnot, the way she speaks, those different elements, that it's enough ingrained into the Babylonian culture that they still have their Jewish elements, but they don't stand out to everybody. And so that's why Mordecai has to explain, I'm a Jew, instead of them going, oh, he's a Jew, because we can tell he's a Jew. That's not the type of situation that it was. So, verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Whether or not this was a racial thing, was it that Haman hated all of the Jews because of what Mordecai did or didn't do? Was he kind of casting his hatred of Mordecai on all of Mordecai's people? Or was this a principle thing? That it wouldn't have mattered if it was Mordecai or any other Jew, no Jew was going to bow down to Haman. Because, perhaps, of this fact that they're not going to bow down in worship to anyone but Jehovah. And it's kind of split in terms of why is Haman so upset and so angry about this? Obviously, he feels like he's being disrespected. That's not Mordecai's intention, I don't believe. But Haman, either because of a racial thing or because of the fact that they're Jews, they won't bow down and show me the respect I'm due, he wants to destroy them all, including Mordecai. Nolan?
Possibly a connection to someone suggesting, if this is the Agag, the King Agag from 1 Samuel 15, Mordecai is also a Benjamite, as Saul was.
Yep.
Now, if this guy knew his family history, and
Yeah.
there's an opportunity to take that out to the fullest extent.
It could be a blood vengeance type of thing. It could be.
We're not told.
Yeah, that could be. I hadn't thought about that. That's true. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, talk about going way back.
Yeah, his anger was pretty big. I mean, this
Well,
his fury.
When you talk about genocide, that's really what's being described here. It's genocide. Okay, he's going to take out not just Mordecai, but all of the Jews. That's a pretty big deal. Okay, that's a big thing. So Haman's he's pretty full of himself. His britches are pretty big, as my grandmother would say. And so it sounds like Mordecai thinks, for whatever reason, again, was this a racial thing? Was it a principle thing? Was it a blood vengeance thing? It's hard to say. Regardless, that's his plan. In verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the lot, before Haman, to determine the day and the month, until it fell in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. That's kind of an interesting component that Haman includes here, that they have their own laws. My understanding of the assimilation of the Jews into Babylon was that there were certain elements of their culture they were allowed to keep, but it wasn't quite like it's going to be in the New Testament, where the Sadducee, that you have the Sanhedrin Council, who has authority up to a certain point, but then the overarching authority has to deal with the Romans. My understanding of this assimilation was that there wasn't any kind of a central identity of the Jews. That was kind of the point of assimilating them, was that there was no area just for the Jews, like there was in Egypt. Okay, remember there was a specific area in Egypt for all the Hebrews. My understanding was that they were assimilated in all, in fact, even Haman says, dispersed among the people. Now, how are you going to keep track of an entirely separate series of laws for a people that are dispersed, scattered in your people? So, and Haman doesn't specifically name the Jews. Okay, so there may be a little bit of creative narrative that Haman is creating. Okay, so some of this may not specifically have applied to the Jews, but Haman may be kind of adding this in here. But he says they do not keep the king's laws, and of course we all know which law specifically Haman felt like they weren't keeping. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. Whether or not the king knew that he was signing the death warrant of the Jews specifically, okay, of course, eventually it's going to come out that Esther's a Jew and she's going to beg for the people and so forth. Sorry to spoil it if you didn't know. But it sounds, the way Haman words this is it's almost like he's trying to pull one over on the king. Okay, that's just the impression I get. And of course, that's the impression I get of Haman anyways. He's kind of a sleazy character. All right, he's kind of looking for ways to one-up however he can, an advantage. And so regardless of whether Haman specifically mentions the Jews here, maybe Ahasuerus, and of course, again, we're several generations past the initial bringing of the Jews, or bringing of Judah into Babylon. That being the case, Ahasuerus, this may not be a... Keep in mind, Babylon, they assimilated tons of nations. Okay? The Jews were just one. It wasn't like they were the only one that they conquered. So keeping up with all the peoples that Babylon conquered over the last 100 some odd years may not be on Ahasuerus' top of his list of stuff to learn. Okay, regardless, Haman, the way he paints it, is that there's a group of people, they don't listen to you, and they don't obey you. I don't believe that's true. Okay, now, granted, if the king says, hey, I want you all to worship me, no, I don't believe the Jews were going to do that. But I believe Haman is taking some creative liberty here to paint the Jews in the worst light possible. Thoughts or comments?
He's the second guy in command. You're going to believe him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Original mainstream media.
Original mainstream media. There you go. Yeah. I mean, he's painting a narrative. Okay. And the king, it almost sounds like the king just signs off on it. Okay. It doesn't sound like the king asks a lot of questions. The king takes his signet ring, verse 10, from his hand, gives it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Again, Haman's the enemy of the Jews, not necessarily that the Agagites were, but Haman is the enemy here. Yes, sir?
Kind of sounds like the king is looking at the opportunity to make some 10,000
Yeah.
gallons of silver.
The money, the economics of the situation, which
Here's the ring.
That-
Bring the money.
that's a king for you. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think maybe the economics of it was perhaps the most important thing here. And again, I don't think that this is something that the king really thought all the way through. So, verse 11, the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. Verse 12, the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded. So notice the king didn't write this decree. He gave his signet ring. And what's the importance of the signet ring? Huh?
Approval.
Okay, and what would they do with the signet ring? Yeah, they would stamp the decree. And this is a ring that was unique to the king to show that this has the king's stamp on it. Okay, whether, of course, we're familiar with the medieval element with the wax and having the ring smacked in the wax. In this time period, most of the sources that I've seen, that they had some sort of almost engraving where it would punch an engraving into the parchment or decree, whatever it was written out of, to make a symbol in it. whether it was wax. I think that's more of a medieval thing. But regardless, the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. The decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were in over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. This was a big deal. Okay, this wasn't like a telegram, send it out, okay, some people are aware of it. No. I didn't even think to have a map up here of the extent of Babylon in its heyday and how big of an empire we're talking about. We're talking about snail mail, the ancient way. All of these letters had to be couried out to all the provinces. Everybody had to be made aware of it. And in essence, it's almost like it's open season. Okay, it's like you know, there's several different states right now that are dealing with some kind of weird iguana-looking lizard, and it's encroaching on natural habitats in Florida and Georgia, and the government said it's open season on these lizards. So anybody who wants to go and shoot these lizards can do so. Okay, anybody who is of a mind to do it, go do it. Now, the only thing that would be different about this is, well, other than the fact that you're hunting humans, is the fact that you're getting paid for it. Okay, you will get paid if you basically, they're a bunch of paid mercenaries to go hunt the Jews on this certain day. That's the decree that has gone out. Verse 14, a copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. All right. We'll stop there with chapter 3. Like I said, Esther and Mordecai, the account of this, trying to separate the account from the character of Esther and Mordecai, it was easier said than done. And so I feel like if we can read through the account and then notice the characteristics of Haman or of Mordecai and Esther as we go, I think that's probably the best way to do it. But we'll try not to take super long doing it, maybe just another 2 classes or so to finish up Esther and Mordecai. So, Lord willing, we'll start with chapter 4 next week. Thank you, everybody.